They gave humanity 72 hours to surrender every colony, every ship, every weapon, or face total annihilation. The Galactic Council called it a mercy. They called us primitives, playing at civilization. They said we'd be forgotten in a generation. They were wrong about all of it. If you've ever wondered what happens when the most stubborn species in the known universe finally runs out of patience, buckle in, because this story will change the way you see humanity forever. Hit that like button, subscribe to HFY Endurance Tales, and drop a comment telling me, would you have sent that warning? Now let's move forward into the fire. The Galactic Council's chamber on Veth Prime was built to humble. That was the only word for it. The central hall of the interstellar conclave stretched nearly 400 meters from floor to ceiling, carved from a single hollowed asteroid that had been hauled into orbit 3,000 years ago. The walls were embedded with crystalline panels that displayed the flags, seals, and territorial maps of every member species. 41 of them, each one older than human writing, most of them older than human fire. Commander David Harrow walked through that hall like he owned it. He didn't, of course. He was one human in a room built for gods. 6'2", broad-shouldered, wearing the deep navy dress uniform of the United Earth Command, with 4 rows of service ribbons on his chest, and exactly 0 expression on his face. 43 years old, former Special Operations, current Fleet Intelligence Officer, first tier. The kind of man who had learned a long time ago that showing emotion in enemy territory was the same as showing your throat. The conclave had summoned him. That was what they called it, a summons. Not an invitation, not a diplomatic meeting, a summons, like he was a subject appearing before a court, rather than a representative of 4 billion people. He had accepted anyway. That was part of the plan. The council's primary chamber opened before him, and the sound hit first. A low, resonant hum from dozens of alien species communicating in frequencies that overlapped human hearing in strange ways. He could feel some of it in his chest. The translation implant behind his left ear worked constantly, processing the wash of languages into something coherent, though it occasionally stuttered when the Veth elders used their subsonic registers. 41 sets of eyes, or whatever passed for eyes, turning toward him. At the head of the semicircular dais sat High Arbiter Sorvin, a Veth elder whose skin shifted between deep violet and gray as his emotional state changed. He was very old, and currently a very satisfied shade of purple. Behind him, arrayed in tiered seating that rose toward the asteroid's curved interior walls, sat representatives who collectively governed 83% of charted space. And then there was the one who caught Harrow's attention. She stood at the edge of the diplomatic observer's platform, off to the left, slightly separate from the council proper. A Zahari. Her species was not a council member, but held special observer status, due to their role as neutral analysts. She was tall, lean, covered in fine iridescent scales that caught the chamber light and threw it back in soft blues and greens. Her eyes were large, set wide, compound adjacent, built for seeing in multiple directions with a clarity humans couldn't match. Right now those eyes were fixed on him with an expression that, even across species lines, read unmistakably as careful assessment. Her name, he'd been briefed, was Sen Avari, Chief Tactical Analyst for the Zahari Observer Corps. She had written 3 academic papers on human military doctrine that the Council had used as evidence of humanity's strategic limitations. He had read all 3 on the transport over. She wasn't wrong about the limitations. She just didn't know what compensated for them. High Arbiter Sorven spoke, and the translation rolled through Harrow's implant a half-second later. Commander Harrow of the United Earth Command, you have been called before this body to receive the Conclave's final determination regarding the Kepler Corridor dispute and the matter of humanity's continued unilateral expansion into protected Veth territorial buffers. Harrow said nothing. He stood at the center of the floor, with his hands clasped behind his back, and waited. Sorvin's skin flickered with faint amusement. "You have nothing to say?" "I was under the impression," Harrow said, "that I was here to listen. If you'd like me to speak, I will. But I was told this was a determination, not a conversation." A ripple moved through the chamber. Several species reacted to that. The Dorhan cluster minds made a sound like shifting gravel, which his implant tagged as laughter. Sorvin leaned forward. "The Conclave has determined that human expansion must cease immediately and permanently. All territories claimed in the last 30 years beyond the original settlement line will revert to Council stewardship. Earth will be permitted to retain its home system and 3 colony worlds. You will have 60 days to comply." Harrow let the words settle. Then he reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced a data chip. Compact, sealed with Earth Command encryption, and set it on the stone floor in front of him. Because there was no table, no podium, no diplomatic furniture. They hadn't given him one. That was deliberate. "I anticipated this outcome," he said. "That chip contains Earth's formal response. It is a legal document, filed simultaneously with every neutral body in charted space, including the Zahari Observer Corps." He glanced briefly at Senavari, who had gone very still. "It constitutes our final warning. You have 72 hours to withdraw the determination and open genuine negotiation. If you don't, Earth Command will treat this Conclave's decision as an act of war and respond accordingly." The chamber erupted. Sorvin's skin went deep red. Rage. He didn't need the translation. "You dare threaten this body?" "I don't threaten," Harrow said, his voice the same temperature it had been the entire time. "I document. That's the difference between a warning and a threat. Read the chip." He turned and walked toward the exit. Behind him, the laughter had stopped. And somewhere in the rising storm of alien voices, Senavari watched him go with those wide compound eyes. And for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure her analysis had been right. She pulled out her own datapad and started reading the chip's transmitted copy. She got 3 pages in before the blood drained from her face. The 72 hours passed. The Conclave did not respond. That wasn't entirely true. They responded. Just not the way Harrow had meant. Within the first 24 hours, the Council's media apparatus, which was vast and old and very good at what it did, had reframed his warning as a tantrum. Human Commander issues ultimatum. Galaxy responds with patience. Read the translated headline, cycling through most Veth news networks. 3 council members gave speeches describing Earth's position as the desperate posturing of a juvenile civilization. The Dorhan cluster mind issued a collective statement calling the warning philosophically incoherent, which was the Dorhan equivalent of a dismissive laugh. Harrow was back aboard the UES Meridian by hour 6. The Meridian was a Titan-class fleet command ship, not a warship technically, but built on the same hull frame as the fleet's heaviest carriers, and armed well enough that the distinction was largely academic. She sat at the edge of the Kepler Corridor transit zone, alone, which was exactly where Harrow had left her. No fleet, no escort, just the one ship. The Council's observers had noted that with visible satisfaction. One ship meant no escalation. One ship meant Earth was posturing. That was also part of the plan. "They've moved the 9th Colonial Fleet to the Hareth Waypoint," said Lieutenant Commander Grayson Webb, his intelligence officer, pulling up the tactical overlay. Webb was young, sharp, and currently deeply stressed in the way young intelligence officers got when they realized the briefings they'd spent months writing were about to become reality. 47 warships, Veth-class capital ships, 6 of them. They're not hiding it. They're not supposed to hide it, Harrow said. He was standing in the Meridian's intelligence center, a long room deep in the ship's core with low lighting and walls covered in live data. They want us to see it. It's a visual argument. It's 47 warships, sir. I know what it is, Grayson. He looked at the overlay. The Harif waypoint put that fleet between the Kepler corridor and Earth's nearest colony cluster. The Brennan Worlds. 4 inhabited planets with a combined population of 60 million. What's their current movement vector? Slow approach, consistent with a blockade establishment rather than a strike posture. But at their current rate, they reach the Brennan perimeter in, Webb did the math, 19 hours. Harrow checked the clock on the wall. Then the deadline expires in 4 hours, and they reach Brennan in 19. That's a 15-hour window. Window for what? Harrow looked at him. For everything. He left the intelligence center and walked to the ship's communications hub, where a secure channel had been holding for the last several hours. A channel he had not yet opened, because the timing had to be exact. He sat down, verified the encryption, and opened it. On the other end was not Earth Command. It was not a fleet admiral or a government official. It was Sen Avari of the Zahari Observer Corps, her compound eyes lit faintly in the blue of her private comm terminal. Her expression doing something complicated that his human brain translated as concerned but not sympathetic. "Commander Harrow," she said. Her voice was precise, lightly accented through the translation layer, each word placed with the care of someone who had spent years learning to communicate with species who used language very differently than her own. "I have completed my analysis of your formal warning document. And I have a question." She paused. "Your document lists 11 specific military actions Earth Command is prepared to take if the Council does not comply. Actions described in clinical procedural language, with specific coordinates, timing windows, and resource allocations." Her head tilted. A Zahari gesture, his briefing file said, indicated either confusion or deep focus. "You filed this with every neutral body in charted space. 64 organizations, including the Conclave's own legal archive." "Yes. So every action you intend to take is already on record." "Yes." Her eyes shifted, both sets of lenses adjusting in a way that reminded him faintly of a camera refocusing, though the analogy was imprecise. "Why would you tell your enemy exactly what you're going to do?" Harrow leaned back in his chair. "2 reasons. First, because we mean it, and we want the historical record to be clean. When this is over, no one gets to say they weren't warned, or that we acted without cause, or that we violated any law. Every step we take will be documented, filed, and permanent." He let that sit for a moment. "Second, because the Conclave read that document and they still didn't comply, which tells me they don't believe we can do what we said we'd do, and that's a mistake I'm comfortable with them making." Sen Avari was quiet for a long time. Her bioluminescent scales shifted through several colors that his briefing file hadn't fully cataloged. "My analysis of human military doctrine," she said slowly, "concluded that your species' primary strategic weakness was overconfidence in direct confrontation, that you compensated for inferior numbers with aggression and absorbed losses that other species would consider catastrophic. That's a fair read of our history. I think," she said carefully, "that I missed something." Before he could answer, Webb's voice cut through the comm. "Commander, the Conclave just issued a public statement. They've formally rejected the warning as legally non-binding, and declared the Kepler corridor a closed zone. And sir," a pause that Harrow didn't like, "they just lit up the Brennan perimeter with targeting arrays. They're not waiting for their fleet. They have orbital platforms." Harrow stood up. "Sen Avari," he said, "I'm going to suggest you find somewhere safe to be for the next few hours. Somewhere with good sensor coverage and a recording system you trust." "Why?" "Because you're an analyst, and you're about to see something worth analyzing." He closed the channel, turned to the Meridian's comm officer. "Open the fleet channel." "Sir," the officer said carefully, We don't have a fleet. Harrow allowed himself exactly one small, quiet smile, the first since this whole thing started. Open it anyway. And somewhere in the dark between stars, things began to move. The Conclave's orbital platforms around the Brennan worlds were a statement of intent, not just hardware. There were 36 of them. Old Veth military infrastructure, the kind that had been placed in orbit 40 years ago, when the Veth Empire was still expanding and didn't yet have to pretend it wasn't. They were large, heavily armored, and equipped with directed energy weapons capable of glassing a surface from orbit. The Council had never used them on a populated world. That was the thing they always said. They had never used them on a populated world. Harrow had read the Calith 4 report. Sealed, marked classified under Conclave authority. He had obtained it anyway, because that was what fleet intelligence officers did. And what it described was a Veth orbital bombardment of a Calith 4 settlement 60 years ago that the official record called a precision anti-insurgent operation. 14,000 Calith civilians had died. The file used the word incidental. He had included a copy in the formal warning document, filed with all 64 neutral bodies, on record permanently in the Conclave's own legal archive. That was what Senavari had gone pale reading. Now Harrow stood on the Meridian's bridge, watching the tactical display update in real time, and the thing that looked like a problem to everyone else looked, to him, like a sequence. Fleet channel is open, the comm officer reported. No response. That's fine. Harrow pulled up the command interface. Send authentication Delta 7 actual. Webb looked up from his station. That's a black tier code, sir. That requires fleet command authorization from 3. I have 3, Harrow said. Webb stared at him. When did you, Grayson, trust the process? The authentication sent. For 6 seconds, nothing happened. Then, the tactical display began to change. They came from the dark. Not from behind the Meridian. Not from the direction of Earth. From the dark. From the scattered dead zones between transit corridors. From the shadow of a gas giant, 3 light minutes away. From the edges of sensor range, where even Veth long-array equipment struggled. Ships running silent, with heat signatures managed to near zero, moving on momentum alone until the moment they received the authentication code and powered up. 30 ships, then 60, then 90, then 140. They were not the biggest fleet Earth had ever fielded, but they were not arranged like a fleet. They were arranged like a net. The Veth 9th Colonial Fleet at Harith Waypoint detected them 17 seconds later. Harrow watched the enemy formation react on the tactical display. A sudden scramble, ships pivoting, targeting arrays lighting up. He could imagine the communications erupting over there. He could imagine the Veth fleet commander, whoever they were, staring at their own display, trying to understand why 140 human ships were arranged in a specific geometric pattern that didn't look like a battle line. It wasn't a battle line. It was a fire direction grid, a system of overlapping firing solutions that could concentrate the fleet's total output on any point within the net's volume simultaneously, with 0 gaps and 0 warning time. Developed in secret over 8 years. Never used in combat. Never shown to any foreign observer. The Conclave's analysts had modeled human tactics based on their historical record. Their models were now wrong. Sir, Webb said quietly. Conclave emergency comm coming through. Hi, Arbiter Sorven. Sorven's voice came through without visual. And Harrow noted that he was skipping the visual, which meant he was not calm enough to maintain the diplomatic face. Commander Harrow, this provocation will result in... Hi, Arbiter, Harrow said. I'm going to stop you there. This is not a provocation. Every ship you're seeing on your display was listed by name, class, and coordinates in the formal warning document you received 72 hours ago. You had the information. You chose not to believe it. He paused. I want to be clear about something. I have not fired a single weapon. I have not moved a ship inside the Brennan defensive perimeter. I have done nothing that was not described in advance in a legally filed document. The next move is yours, and it will also be on the record." Silence from Sorven's end. Harrow could hear something in the background. Voices, movement. The council chamber in emergency session. Then Sorven said something that Harrow had not expected. "The platforms will demonstrate our seriousness." Harrow's jaw tightened. High Orbiter. The Brennan orbital platforms powered their weapons arrays. The energy signature lit up every sensor in the region. Harrow turned to his tactical officer. "Status of Delta packages." "All Delta packages confirmed ready, sir." Webb was staring at him. "Sir, if those platforms fire on Brennan 4, they won't get the chance." Harrow straightened. "Execute Delta." What happened next took 11 seconds. Harrow would later reconstruct it moment by moment, because the debrief required it. But in the moment, it felt like a single, continuous event. 42 specialized ships in the net. Not warships, not capital ships, but fast, narrow electronic warfare platforms that the Conclave's analysts had classified as logistics and communication vessels, because their sensor profiles had been deliberately built to look that way. Fired simultaneously. Not weapons, signal packages. Directed electromagnetic pulses of a specific frequency, developed after 8 years of studying Veth military hardware, targeting the orbital platform's central command integration nodes. 36 platforms went dark simultaneously. Not destroyed, offline. Every weapon, every targeting array, every thruster, all of it locked out by a kill code threaded through the signal. The Brennan worlds sat unharmed beneath them. Sorven's voice came back, and it was different now, stripped of the purple satisfaction. "What have you done?" "Documented everything," Harrow said. "That's all I ever do." But before he could take a breath, Webb's hand shot up. "Sir, reading an emergency signal from Brennan 3, ground level. The Veth have troops on the surface. They've had them there for 3 days, sitting quiet in the civilian zones. They're moving now. Ground troops, civilian zones, 60 million people on 4 worlds." Harrow had 11 seconds. He used 4 of them to think. "Get me the 4th Ranger Command," he said, "and tell them to stop being gentle." Brennan 3 was a cold world. High altitude, thin air, long winters that turned the highland plateaus into something that looked like the surface of the moon with better lighting. The civilian settlements were built low, clustered in the valley basins where the geothermal warmth made survival reasonable. And the architecture was the functional kind. Wide, squat buildings designed to handle wind loads and cold snaps, rather than look impressive. It was not a world built for ground war. But ground war had come anyway. The Veth troops, 2 full battalions, heavy infantry, equipped for cold weather operations, had been embedded in the civilian zones for 72 hours under cover of a humanitarian supply convoy that the Conclave had arranged 6 weeks ago. A supply convoy. Humanitarian aid. It was nearly elegant, if you didn't think about what it meant. Harrow thought about what it meant constantly during the 12 minutes it took for the 4th Ranger Command's first insertion wave to reach atmosphere. He was watching the feeds from orbit, drone imagery, ground sensor relays, the digital map of Brennan 3's main settlement basin building in real time on his tactical board. 6,000 civilians in the primary population center. Veth infantry had established control points at every major transit junction and were moving toward the central civic district, which was where the settlement's emergency shelter was located. They weren't firing. They didn't need to yet. The threat was architectural. They were arranging themselves so that any human response would endanger civilians. It was a good tactic. It would have worked against most militaries. Harrow keyed the Ranger channel. "Shepard 1, this is Meridian Actual. Give me your read." The voice that came back was Captain Marcus Cole, 4th Rangers, and he sounded like a man who had done this before. Meridian, I've got eyes on 6 control points. Infantry moving in columns of 8 toward the Civic District. They're not in combat posture. This is occupation posture. They want to be seen. Agreed. What's your play? We don't hit the control points, Cole said immediately. That's what they want. We thread the needle. My teams go direct to the Civic Shelter, establish a perimeter, and get the civilians out through the storm drain network on the south side, while the VEF are still watching the streets. A pause. It's going to be tight, sir. Really tight. Define tight. We'll have maybe 6 minutes between when they realize what we're doing and when they can reposition to cut us off. 6 minutes to move 6,000 people through a drainage tunnel that fits about 40 people wide. Looked at the numbers. Looked at the clock. What do you need? I need someone to give the VEFs something else to look at. Harrow turned to Webb. The 3 fast movers we kept in reserve? Webb pulled up their status. Ready. Subsonic approach. They won't hear them until they're overhead. I don't want them overhead, Harrow said. I want them low. I want them to come through that valley at rooftop level, lit up like New Year's, making as much noise as possible. Full active sensor pings, emergency broadcast frequencies, everything. I want every VEF soldier in that basin looking up. Webb blinked. That's sir. Those are stealth aircraft. We'd be burning their profiles. I know. Do it. Yes, sir. Webb started working the commands. Then he stopped. Sir, incoming signal from the VEF Battalion Command. They're demanding we stand down the orbital approach, or they begin. He swallowed. They're saying structural engagement of civilian infrastructure. Harrow's expression didn't change. His voice didn't change either, but something in it went very quiet and very hard. Record that transmission. Tag it, timestamp it, file it to all 64 neutral bodies and the legal archive immediately. Already doing it. Good. He looked at the clock. Send the fast movers. What happened in the next 6 minutes would get written about later in ways that Harrow found slightly embarrassing, because the accounts tended to dramatize what was, in the moment, a very precise piece of logistics. 3 aircraft at rooftop level through a narrow highland valley, active sensors screaming, creating a wall of noise and light, an electronic signature that every VEF infantry soldier in the basin turned to look at, because that was the correct military response to an unexpected aerial approach. 412 Rangers moved through the storm drain network in the time the VEF spent watching the sky. 6,214 civilians made it out the south side of the settlement before the VEF battalion commander realized the street-level population had vanished. By the time VEF troops reached the civic shelter, it was empty. Every civilian out, 0 casualties, and on the walls of the shelter someone had taped a printed copy of the formal warning document. Page 1, paragraph 1, the part that read, Earth Command will prioritize civilian protection in all operational theaters, including in areas of active enemy occupation. Cole's voice crackled back on the channel. Shepard 1 to Meridian, package delivered, all civilians accounted for. A beat. Someone on my team thought the wall decoration was a nice touch. Harrow allowed himself exactly nothing in terms of visible reaction. Pull your teams back to extraction point and get them off the surface. We're not done. Copy that. What's next? The VEF 9th Colonial Fleet at Harith was still sitting in position. They hadn't moved since the net appeared, because moving meant committing, and committing meant choosing. And right now the fleet commander over there was trying to figure out what the rules were. Whether this was still a political situation or a military one. Whether the council was going to give them an order they could actually execute. They were going to need to make that choice very soon. Because Harrow had just received a priority signal from the Meridian's deep space sensor array. The kind of reading that didn't come from a VEF fleet, and didn't match any profile in the Conclave's known registry. Someone else was coming. Something else. And it was very, very large. The signal resolved over the course of 4 minutes, and by the time the Meridian sensor suite had a complete picture, the bridge had gone very quiet. Classification? Harrow asked. His sensor officer, Lieutenant Dana Park, pulled the data 3 times before she answered, because she was thorough and because she wanted to be sure. It's a VEF Judgment-class orbital siege platform, sir. Designation, she checked. Sorven's Reach. It's named after the High Arbiter. A pause. We have no record of this vessel being active. Last intelligence assessment had it listed as decommissioned. Harrow looked at Webb. Webb looked back at him. How long until it reaches a firing position on Brennan 4? Harrow asked. 40 minutes. Maybe 38. A Judgment-class platform was not a ship in the conventional sense. It was a mobile weapons system, a construct the size of a small moon, designed for one purpose: sustained orbital bombardment of planetary surfaces. The VEF had built 3 of them during a war 4 centuries ago, a conflict so brutal it had reshaped the political geography of the inner systems. They had never been used since. They were supposedly decommissioned. Supposedly. The document he had filed, the formal warning with all its specific listed actions, had not accounted for this. You couldn't account for a weapon that didn't exist on any active registry. That was the point of keeping it off the registry. He had 12 things to think about simultaneously and 38 minutes to act on all of them. Get me Senavari, he said. She came online in less than a minute, and the look on her face told him she had already seen the sensor data. Sahari observer access meant she had feeds he didn't control. Her bioluminescence scales were dim, cycling through a low, slow pattern that his briefing file associated with something close to horror. You see it, he said. The Sorven's Reach, she said. Her voice was steady, but precise in the way of someone working very hard to keep it that way. Commander, I need to tell you something. My analysis papers, the ones the Council used to justify their position, I stated that human military doctrine was unlikely to escalate beyond a defensive posture without direct provocation. The Council used that framing to argue that your warning would not be executed. She paused. They were also using it to justify moving the Sorven's Reach. If I was right that humans wouldn't act, then there was no risk. They could use the platform to force a capitulation without fear of real military response. But you were wrong. I was wrong, she said. And now, they have a weapon in transit that they committed to before they knew that. Harrow turned that over. Can you get that assessment on the record? Official Zihari Observer Corps panels? I already have, she said quietly. 30 minutes ago, I filed a formal correction to all 3 papers and submitted a preliminary observer report to the neutral bodies describing the Sorven's Reach's current vector and the Council's communication record. Her head tilted. The High Arbiter will know I did this. I will not be permitted in Council spaces again. Harrow looked at her for a moment. Thank you. Don't thank me. Stop it. He had, in fact, had a plan for this possibility. Not for the Sorven's Reach specifically, because no one had known it existed, but for the class of problem it represented. A weapon too large to destroy with the fleet he had, on a timeline too short to wait for reinforcement, pointed at a civilian population. You didn't destroy something like that in 38 minutes. Not with 140 ships. Not without taking losses that made the whole thing a Pyrrhic exercise. But you didn't always have to destroy a weapon to stop it. Webb, he said, the Kepler corridor transit architecture. Pull up the junction points. Webb pulled them up without asking why. That was one of the things Harrow valued about him. The Kepler corridor was the primary transit route connecting the Brennan worlds to the inner systems, and also, critically, the route the Sorven's Reach would use to reach firing position. It was structured space, defined by a series of gravitational waypoints and stable transit lanes that made faster-than-light movement predictable and safe. Outside those lanes, FTL travel was possible but hazardous, particularly for something the size of a small moon. Junction Point 4, Harrow said. What's the gravitational variance on the tertiary lane this time of year? Park looked it up. 0.73 flux variance. High enough that a vessel exceeding Class 9 mass rating is required to compensate with active gravitational management or risk lane collapse. And if a vessel with Class 9 mass is pushing through that junction at combat speed with its gravitational management systems disrupted. The bridge went quiet in a different way than before. Lane collapse, Park said. They'd be forced to drop to sublight. Re-entry into FTL would take hours, Harrow said, at minimum. He looked at the tactical net. Fast, small, and armed with the Brennan pattern signal disruptors we used on the orbital platforms. I need them at junction point 4 in 22 minutes. Webb was already running calculations. The disruptors were designed for stationary platforms, sir. A moving target the size of the Sorven's reach, the spread pattern won't cover the whole hull. It doesn't need to. It just needs to cover the gravitational management array. He pulled up the platform's technical file, available in Zahari observer databases, which was how he'd accessed it. Here, forward dorsal section, 3 clusters. Webb stared at the file. How do you have detailed schematics of a supposedly decommissioned Veth weapons platform? Harrow said nothing. Webb decided not to pursue it. 22 minutes is going to be very close, sir. Everything today has been very close, Grayson. The 6 ships moved. The Sorven's reach moved. The clock ran. At junction point 4, 19 minutes and 40 seconds later, 6 small human ships running at maximum speed came out of the corridor's tertiary lane from the opposite direction. Not attacking, not aggressive, just present, just in the lane, their Brennan pattern disruptors firing in a very specific pattern at a very specific section of the massive platform's hull. The Sorven's reach dropped to sublight. It would take 11 hours to re-enter FTL. In 11 hours, the diplomatic and legal landscape would look very different. Harrow let out a breath. Then Sorven's voice came over the comm again, and this time it was not purple satisfaction or stripped-down shock. It was something that had run out of options and hadn't yet figured out how to admit it. Commander Harrow, the Conclave is prepared to discuss. High Arbiter, Harrow said. I'm going to stop you there again. You used a decommissioned weapon of mass destruction that is not on any active registry. You embedded troops in civilian population centers as human shields. You attempted to use an orbital strike platform on 4 inhabited worlds. All of this is documented. All of it is filed. A pause. The Conclave will stand down all forces immediately, unconditionally, and submit to neutral body jurisdiction within the next 2 hours. If you do, we begin negotiations tomorrow. And if we don't? Harrow looked at the tactical display. At 140 ships arranged in a net that the Conclave's fleet still hadn't moved through because they didn't know how. At 6,000 civilians safe on Brennan 3. At a siege platform sitting helpless at sublight. Then I file the next section of the warning document, he said. And we find out which one of us really wasn't bluffing. The channel stayed open for a long time. Then, Sorven said one word. 2 hours. Harrow closed the channel, looked at Webb. Webb looked back. Is it over? Webb asked. The shooting part, Harrow said, and then, almost to himself, the hard part's just starting. Resolution. Epilogue. The tribunal took 4 months to convene, and 11 months to conclude. It was held on a neutral station, a Zahari-administered platform in the quiet space between the inner systems and the corridor. And it was the largest legal proceeding in recorded interstellar history, which was a distinction nobody had wanted to earn. 41 species sent observers. 29 of them sent legal teams. 9 of them sent representatives to testify. Every session was transmitted on open frequencies to every inhabited system in charted space, because the neutral bodies had insisted on it, and because Harrow's team had made the same insistence from the start. Everything on the record, everything visible, The evidence was, as Harrow had always intended it to be, comprehensive. The Caliph 4 file, the one he'd obtained and filed with the warning document, turned out to be one of 6 similar records. The neutral bodies, with access now granted under tribunal authority, found 5 more. 40 years of precision anti-insurgent operations that weren't precise and weren't anti-insurgent. The Conclave's legal team spent the first 3 months arguing about jurisdiction and definitions. Then the 6 files went into evidence, and they stopped arguing about definitions. High Arbiter Sorven was removed from his position in the 7th month, not by the tribunal, but by the Veth Council itself, which was a distinction that mattered. It meant the Veth were choosing to be on the right side of the record, rather than the wrong one. His replacement was younger, quieter, and had spent the previous decade as a minority voice on the council, arguing for a different approach to the expansion disputes. Harrow spent most of the tribunal on Brennan 3, which surprised the people who expected him to be at the center of things. But the Meridian was in dry dock for maintenance. His operational duties were in a quiet phase, and there was something about Brennan 3, the cold, the high altitude, the long view across plateau country, that suited him. He wrote reports. He walked. He did not give interviews, because the journalists who found him quickly learned that he would answer exactly the questions he was asked, and nothing more, in careful, specific language that made for poor headlines. Sanavari found him on Brennan 3 in the 9th month. She came without an appointment, which was a Zahari thing. Her species found scheduling meetings for personal conversations slightly strange, a kind of false formality. She showed up at the door of the small building Earth Command had designated as his temporary office, and when he opened the door, she said without preamble, "I want to understand something." They sat across from each other in a room with a view of the plateau. She was different from the first time he'd seen her. Quieter, in her bioluminescence, steadier. The tribunal had been hard on her, not because she was implicated in anything wrong, but because she was the analyst who had gotten it wrong, and in her culture, that was a serious thing. "My papers," she said, "my analysis of human military doctrine. I concluded you were predictable, limited by individual psychology, that your decision-making under stress collapsed toward aggression and away from strategy." "You weren't entirely wrong," Harrow said. "I was wrong enough." She looked at him with those wide, compound eyes. "What I missed, what I couldn't model, was the deliberateness. Every action you took was planned in advance and documented. You were not improvising under stress. You were executing a sequence that accounted for multiple contingencies simultaneously. My models assumed humans acted from instinct and covered it with rationale afterward. But you did the opposite. You reasoned completely first, and then you acted without hesitation." Harrow thought about that. "It's not a species trait," he said. "It's a trained behavior. We're not naturally that way. Some of us aren't. A lot of us aren't." He looked out at the plateau. "We have a long history of getting it catastrophically wrong, so some of us spent a very long time building systems to do it right. Documentation, process, law. The warning wasn't a formality. It was the actual strategy. Every step we took was only possible because the step before it was already on the record." Senavari was quiet for a while. "I am writing a new paper," she said finally. "I know. I was asked to review the methodology." "You were." She tilted her head. The focus gesture. The deep attention. "Will you? Get the methodology right, and the council's successor body will actually have something useful. Get it wrong, and we'll be doing this again in a generation. I do not intend to get it wrong again. I know." She stood to leave. At the door she stopped. She had something to say, and she was composing it in the deliberate way she did, setting each word in place before releasing it. At the tribunal, in the final session, when the conclave representatives gave their formal accounting, She turned to look at him. They said that the decision to pursue military dominance was made out of fear, that humanity's growth rate, resource demands, and military development curve were modeled as an extinction-level threat to established powers within 3 generations. I know. I heard the testimony. They were afraid, she said, and they chose war because of it. Yes. And you? She stopped, started again. You were afraid too. I've read your internal command logs, the ones entered into evidence. In the hours before the Sorven's Reach resolved on sensors, you logged a personal note. It said, "If this goes wrong, 60 million people on 4 worlds die because I miscalculated. That is the weight of this. Do not put it down." She held his gaze. You were afraid. You did not choose war because of it. Harrow didn't answer for a moment. Outside, the wind moved across the plateau. No, he said. I chose documentation. She left. He watched through the window as she crossed the settlement's main path, her scales catching the pale Brennan sun and throwing off small constellations of reflected light. The tribunal concluded 6 weeks later. The Veth Empire lost territorial rights to 23 contested zones. The Caliph people received formal reparations and a new seat at a restructured version of the conclave, one that now required every decision of military significance to be filed in advance with a neutral registry, with a mandatory response window in legally binding language. The Kepler corridor was designated permanently open, subject to joint species management. The Sorven's Reach was disassembled. Its components were documented, catalogued, and distributed to 12 neutral archives as a permanent record of what the Veth had hidden and what it had cost them. Harrow attended the signing ceremony because he was required to. He stood in the same chamber where he had set a data chip on the stone floor and been laughed at by 41 species. The chamber looked the same. The crystalline panels still showed the flags and territorial maps of member species, though some of the territories had changed shape. He signed the documents where indicated, in the order indicated, and stepped back. But Sanavari was there, formally, as the Zahari Observer Corps' new chief liaison to the restructured conclave. And before the session closed, she requested the floor for a single statement. It was brief. It was precise. It was transmitted on open frequencies to every inhabited system in charted space. The record shows, she said, that Earth Command filed a formal warning 72 hours before any military action. The record shows that every action taken was documented in advance and executed as documented. The record shows that civilian protection was maintained throughout all operational theaters. And the record shows, she paused, and her scales shifted to a color that his briefing file had never catalogued. Something new, something that looked a great deal like clarity. That humanity warned us, clearly, specifically, lawfully, in language we could not misunderstand. She looked directly at the point where the transmission feeds were strongest. We chose not to believe them. That choice is also on the record, permanently. The chamber was quiet. Outside, on Brennan 3, on 60 million people's worth of cold plateau worlds, the wind kept moving, and nothing was on fire, and the long winter was already turning. Harrow read the transcript that evening. He read Senavari's final line 3 times. Then he closed the file, put it in the permanent archive with everything else, and went to bed. The record was complete. If this story hit different, drop a comment below and tell me, what was the moment that got you? Was it the Brennan rescue, the Junction Point 4 gamble, or that final line from Senavari? Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to HFY Endurance Tales, because humanity's story is just getting started.